they teach that Melchizedek is Shem from another book. Right then and there, that should set off a red flag for you and open your eye that something's not right here. Something's not kosher here, pun intended. So let's continue a little bit further. Now, we saw how Jesus taught the apostles from the law and the prophets. Was Jesus alone in doing this? How did the rest of the apostles preach? How did they teach? How did Brother Paul teach? Because a lot of people mistakenly think that Paul did away with the law, and that's not the case, and we can talk about that in another lesson. But let's see specifically what Paul taught from. Because during the days of Paul, and even in the days of Christ, when the Gospels were written, there was no New Testament. There was no First Corinthians. There was no Book of Romans. There was no Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Definitely was not a Revelation, etc. The only thing they had was commonly, again, called the Old Testament. The Book of the Law, the books of Moses, the prophets, the Psalms, etc. So, what did Paul himself teach from? Let's go to Acts the 13th chapter, and let's hit two quick verses to let the Bible tell us what Paul taught from. Actually, what we're going to do first is show in the days of the church of the New Testament what was being taught in the synagogues. Let's go here first. Acts 13, and we'll specifically show that this is Paul. Acts 13 and 13. Now when Paul and his companions loosed from Paphos, they came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem. But when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch in Pisidia. And they went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and they sat down. So Paul didn't throw away the law of the Sabbath, because he went into the synagogue and sat down. And what did they do in the synagogue? You read Luke, the 4th chapter, you see they did the exact same thing Jesus did. Verse 15, Acts 13, verse 15. And after the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent unto them, saying, Ye men and brethren, if ye have any word of exhortation for the people, say on. And afterwards Paul stood up. But what did they read? They read the law and the prophets, which is commonly called the Old Testament, because that's what they had in that day, and that was enough for them. It was good enough for Christ to teach out of. It was good enough for Paul and the apostles to teach out of. But how come it's not good enough for us nowadays? Why do we have to find extra books that were not included in the laws and the prophets? Y'all understand what I'm saying? Let's read a little bit more about Paul. Well, let's do this. We saw in the New Testament where they read the books of Moses, the law, and the prophets. Let's look in the Old Testament. Let's look in the book of Nehemiah, because this is the time period when the children of Israel, after their first captivity in Babylon, they were commissioned to go back in the land and rebuild the land of Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, etc. Let's look what Nehemiah did. You know, Ezra was the priest of that particular day, but let's look at what Ezra was a scribe, priest scribe. Let's see what him and Nehemiah did. Nehemiah chapter 8, and let's look at verses 1 through 3. And the people gathered themselves together as one man in the street that was before the water gate. And they spake unto Ezra the scribe to bring what? To bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded to Israel. Again, they started with the book of Moses. And that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Number, and Deuteronomy. The first 5 books of Moses. That's what he read to the people. Verse 2. And I'm stressing that point because there's a reason. And this will all make sense in a few minutes. Verse 2. And Ezra the priest brought the law before the congregation, both of men and women, and all that could hear with understanding upon the first day of the 7th month. And he read therein before the street that was before the water gate from morning until midday, before the men and the women, and those that could understand, and the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. They were attentive to the book of the law. What's the book of the law? The first 5 books of Moses. Well, he only had 5 books, but the first 5 books of the Bible, which are the books of Moses, Genesis to Deuteronomy. Let's stay in the book of Nehemiah chapter 8. Let's skip down to verse 13. Now this is the first day of the 7th month. Let's see what they did on the second day. Verse 13. And on the second day were gathered together the chief of the fathers of all the people, the priests, the Levites, unto Ezra the scribe, even to understand the words of the law. And they found written in the law, which the Lord had commanded by Moses, that the children of Israel should dwell in booths in the feast of the 7th month. Now we know this is the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of Tabernacles, however you want to call it. I don't want to discuss that right now because that's not the point of this lesson. The point of this lesson, again, sisters and brothers, is Melchizedek is not Shem. Well, when are you going to get to that, brother? We're getting to there momentarily. Just stick with me, sisters and brothers, because basically I want to build the foundation here. Let's go ahead and skip down to verse 18. Because they were reading the book of the law the first day, they read the book of the law the 7th day, etc., etc. Let's look at here, verse 18. Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 18. Also, day by day, from the first day until the last day, he read in the book of the law of God. And they kept the feast 7 days. On the 8th day was a solemn assembly according to the manner. The whole purpose of me going to Nehemiah chapter 8 was to show that Ezra, the priest, the scribe, read the book of the law, the book of Moses, to the people of the congregation of Israel. That's the book that he read to them. Well, brother, isn't that a given? Apparently not, because you got some brothers nowadays teaching from other books that are not the book of the law of Moses. And with these spurious documents, with these non-canon documents, they came up with a whole brand new doctrine that's totally against what's written in the scriptures. Case in point, Melchizedek being Shem, which we know for the scriptures Melchizedek is not Shem. And we're going to discuss that momentarily. Just give me a few more minutes, sisters and brothers, and we'll get right to the point. I'm just building a solid foundation here to show, per the words of Christ, per the words of the apostles, per the word of Apostle Paul, per the word of Peter, and even per the word of Nehemiah and Ezra, the book of the law begins with Moses. No other book precedes the book of Moses. That's my point. Make a note of that. No other book precedes the book of Moses. No other book supersedes, if you really want to tell the truth, the book of Moses. Let's stay in Nehemiah chapter 9. Let's hit the point home again. And this is the prayer that was given. And they're giving a prayer to the Most High God. Nehemiah 9 verse 3. And they stood up in their place and read in the book of the law of the Lord their God 1/4 part of the day, and another 4th part they confessed and worshiped the Lord their God. And this is one of the prayers that they had given, or the praise that they had given to the Most High. Verse 13 and 14. And this should be it. 13 and 14. Thou camest down also upon Mount Sinai, and spakest with them from heaven, and gavest them right judgments and true laws, good statutes and commandments, and madest known unto them thy holy Sabbath, and commandedst them precepts, statutes, and laws by the hands of Moses thy servant. So Moses is nothing to sneeze at. When we're talking about the books of the Lord, they start with Moses, because Moses was called the servant of the God, of the Most High God. Quiet as kept, Moses was the only prophet that the Lord said he spoke to him face to face, because he spoke to all other prophets by dream and by vision, but he spoke to Moses face to face. That's also in the law. Do we want to go anywhere else in Nehemiah? Let's go to verse 30. Here we go. Nehemiah 9 verse 30. Yet many years didst thou forbear them, and testified against them by thy spirit and thy prophets. Yet they will not give ear. Therefore gavest thou them into the hand of the people of the lands. So the protocol was the book of Moses, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the books of Moses. And we read right here in Nehemiah 9 chapter 30th that the Most High testified against them by his spirit and his prophets. These are the rest of the prophets of the Bible after Moses, the so-called major and minor prophets. But again, this is all the book of the law and the book of the prophets, the entire Old Testament, which we read and understood further in the book of Nehemiah chapter 8 and chapter 9. Now let's go back to Paul in Acts 28 to see if Paul veered from the course. Did Paul teach any other books besides the book of Moses and the book of the prophets? Well, let's let Paul himself tell us this. First thing we're going to do is go to Acts the 26th chapter, and we're going to read two verses, 22 and 23. And this is Paul giving his a witness for himself. In fact, let's look at verse 26. Acts 26, we're going to start at verse 1. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Then Paul stretched forth the hand and answered for himself. So Paul right here is answering the Jews. They were trying to kill him because they thought that he had blasphemed. They thought, and many bore some false witness against Paul at this time. You can read the entire books of Acts to get the full story of it. But I just want to get to the point how Paul preached Jesus and where he preached Jesus from. Verse 22, Acts 26 and 22. Having therefore obtained help of God, I continue unto this day, witnessing both to small and great, saying none other things than those which the prophets and Moses did say should come, that Christ should suffer, and that he should be the first that should rise from the dead, and should show light unto the people and to the Gentiles, which is written in Isaiah the 42nd chapter. Paul stated that he did not say any doctrine outside of the doctrine spoken of by Moses and the prophets. Again, we're hammering the same point home. Do you see the pattern? Moses and the prophets. Moses and the prophets. Moses and the prophets. The book of the law, the prophets. The book of the law and the prophets. Brother, why you keep going to the same point? You sound redundant. Well, I apologize, sisters and brothers, for sounding redundant, but I want to make sure that I can read to you in the Old and the New Testament, specifically where the men of God, the holy men of God, point to the law and to the prophets. The law beginning with the books of Moses, no other book. The law beginning with the book of Moses. That's the entire point. Last thing regarding this, we can go ahead and read Acts the 28th chapter, Acts 28:23. This is Paul again speaking, or he's speaking about Paul. And when they had appointed him a day, Acts 28:23. And when they had appointed him a day, there came many to him into his lodging, to whom he expounded and testified the kingdom of God, persuading them concerning Jesus, both out of the law of Moses and out of the prophets, from morning till evening. Paul preached Jesus out of both the law of Moses, the beginning, the home base, the foundation, and out of the rest of the prophets of the Old Testament. Paul didn't go into any outside book outside of the prophets and outside of the book of the law of Moses. So why are people doing that today when they're trying to preach some new doctrine? We'll discuss that. Now let's talk about one of the so-called lost books of the Bible that people go to try to prove that Melchizedek is Shem. And they go to the so-called Book of Jasher. Now the Bible does speak about a Book of Jasher. However, I will seriously challenge anyone to prove that the Book of Jasher that they have now commonly in the marketplace, in the bookstores, the library, even Amazon.com or on the internet, is the true Book of Jasher, spoken two places in the Old Testament. Joshua the 10th chapter and 2 Samuel the 1st chapter. Let's go ahead and read these, sisters and brothers. I didn't want people to think I'm running from them. I just wanted to build the foundation of Moses and the prophets first and foremost, because that's most important. All this right here is something else we're just going to have to deal with.